Good afternoon. Two issues have come up for the discussion of consequence in our last couple of Zoom meetings, and I would like to address each to the extent that this discussion deserves my comment. The first is the nature of the pandemic and the American government's response to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The virus at first appeared and was recognized as a new variant in Wuhan, China, uh, and the recognition of it as a new situation took place at the end of December of 2019. In retrospect, victims of this particular virus could be found in Italy and in the United States and probably elsewhere in the very late part of the year 2019, but it was not recognized as a new entity until the epidemic in Wuhan, China. The nature of the federal government's response to the new situation was striking in as much as it was fundamentally, don't want to call it a failure, but apparently an intentional dismissal of the issue or an intentional exacerbation of the problem. First of all, when the epidemic was first recognized in China, the United States government was remarkably slow at impounding incoming flights from China into the United States. This substantially increased the number of individuals who were contagious and their entry into the United States from China. Secondly, uh, although lockdowns were temporarily required in order to uh, prevent the further distribution of carriers, they were uh, they were maintained for a much longer time than when in fact was necessary, given the fact that uh, people who were sick with the virus uh, could be reasonably readily identified and quarantined. But much more significant from my point of view is the fact that the federal government not only uh, performed poorly in terms of prevention of the proliferation of carriers, they denied the American public substantial information. The first elements of this information was the uh, necessary components to the immune system. It is well known that vitamin D3 enhances the immune system and enhances it in particular when fighting a virus such as SARS-CoV-2. Secondly, zinc was experimentally known to be an effective inhibitor of the replication of the virus quite early on. None of this information was relayed by the federal government to the American citizens. In point of fact, it was actively and in some cases passively uh, prevented from being shared with the American public. Moreover, within a fairly short period of time, it was known that hydroxychloroquine was an effective treatment of the disease caused by the virus. And the federal response to this knowledge was to demand that the medicine be adequately tested. The kind of testing that was demanded before approval of a new use for hydroxychloroquine will take about 20 years. Instead of allowing individual physicians to use their judgment and to prescribe hydroxychloroquine in an effort to reduce the severity of the disease and to reduce the spread of the disease, the federal government, without outlawing the use of hydroxychloroquine, basically established um, a situation where a physician prescribing hydroxychloroquine would appear to be breaking the law, even though there was no law established. He would appear to be going against the better judgment of his peers and of the federal government. This very appearance created a great deal of social pressure to prevent a physician from prescribing hydroxychloroquine. And any tests that were done by the government or sponsored by the government were designed to fail. One only has to look at the uh, design plan of a couple of hydroxychloroquine test periods to find out that they were introduced to a sick patient well into the advancement of the disease, and therefore, and were also prescribed on a dose that was substantially higher than was necessary for treating the disease. So when they had poor outcomes, it was blamed on the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine rather than on the efficacy and appropriateness of the design. Subsequently, ivermectin was discovered and found to be an effective medication, and the federal government is taking a very, very long walk to getting around to approving ivermectin as a therapy. Unlike hydroxychloroquine, whose availability is substantially limited and is in fact needed for the treatment of, um, of rheumatoid arthritis, ivermectin is a known animal antiparasitic medicine and is used on farm animals and domesticated animals with great rapidity and great frequency. And so the supply of ivermectin for human consumption should not at all be limited. Nevertheless, the demands for 20-year testing periods to demonstrate its safety for human beings when its safety for a host of mammalian species has already been established and is then, in fact, used on humans for different conditions. Nevertheless, it has not been technically approved. The government has done everything it appears is possible to reduce the number and utilization of effective uh, cures and or treatments for the COVID-19 disease. It is hard for me to reconcile this with any uh, benign behavior on the use of on the character of the federal government, and it's very uh, apparent proscription of ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine has and its behavior in terms of reducing the knowledge of effective treatments and the permission to use effective treatments has led me to the conclusion that the federal government fundamentally is at war with its own people. It has created a situation that will magnify the fear of the disease and magnify the severity of the human response to the disease. Uh, Victims of the disease were herded into nursing homes and suffered the consequences of uh, not only crowding, but the condensing of a population that is susceptible to the disease into confined spaces. Uh, I cannot think of a single thing that the federal government has done that would not exacerbate the uh, clinical results of this epidemic. If that isn't a form of warfare against its own people, I don't know what is. The second item is concerning a social situation that took place in the United States on Wednesday, January 6th of 2021. And that is when Vice President Pence was in charge of the uh, counting and tallying of the electoral votes for the election of Joseph Biden and his running mate, Ms. Harris, Kamala Harris, I believe. There was an apparent stand down of the Washington, D.C. police, and a crowd of supporters of Donald Trump gathered outside the Senate chambers. It appeared to me and to a number of other people that the vast majority of these supporters of Donald Trump were peaceful objectors of the travesty of justice that was taking place inside, and intended to uh, show their displeasure with it simply by gathering. However, there were a number of individuals, some of them presumably, and that's my presumption, of provocateurs that became violent, broke through windows, broke into the Senate chambers, climbed to the top of the building, basically acting like hooligans. The vast majority of the members of the crowd, however, who were indeed supporters of Donald Trump and were indeed in opposition to the travesty of the stolen election, were not participating with this. But these individuals who behaved like hooligans, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be provocateurs attempting to give the crowd and its motivations the worst impression they could possibly make on the American public, precisely in order to put into disrepute the movement for substantial democratization of the American electoral process, and for the people who are decrying and objecting to the theft of Americans to lawfully and legitimately elect their president. I have no great love for the president who was apparently electorally defeated, but the evidence for elective malfeasance is substantial. In fact, to my mind, it is overwhelming, but people have to be willing to look at the malfeasance in order to arrive at their own decisions as to whether the evidence is overwhelming or whether it is minimal. Having looked at it and consider it myself overwhelming, there is entirely good reason to object to the accrediting the votes that elected Joseph Biden to the office of president. But the hooligans, I think intentionally, acted in a fashion that brought disrepute and shame on the vast majority of the demonstrators who were behaving in a lawful fashion. These are the two elements that have come up by my instigation in the Zoom meetings, and I wanted to get those introduced onto our video record for future consideration. Thank you very much.